The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that clung to the walls and pressed against every soul present. Rows of faces, strangers to one another, were united by the collective tension in the air. Judge Caroline Evans sat atop her high bench, her presence as commanding as a thundercloud, yet her expression was calm, unreadable. The wood of the gavel in her hand reflected the fluorescent lights above, but it hadn't struck yet. The day's trial was about to begin. At the defendant's table sat a boy who seemed dwarfed by the oversized furniture around him. His name was Damian Brooks, a 17-year-old with deep brown eyes that told a story most wouldn't stop to hear. His fingers clutched the edge of the table, his knuckles pale against his dark skin. A faded blue hoodie hung loose on his thin frame, its sleeves worn thin at the cuffs. Next to him, his overworked public defender flipped through a stack of disorganized papers, his mind already resigned to another loss. The bailiff's voice rang out, sharp and formal, breaking the silence. All rise for the Honorable Judge Caroline Evans. Everyone stood, their movements stiff and synchronized. Caroline nodded slightly, her sharp features unmoving as she took her seat. "You may be seated," she said, her tone clipped, mechanical. She flipped open the case file in front of her, scanning its contents as though it were any other case. Trespassing in a gated community. Refusal to comply with questioning. It was cut and dry, or so she thought. Damian's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried. "I plead not guilty," he said, his words barely more than a whisper, but weighted with an unspoken plea. Judge Evans raised her eyes to meet his. For the first time that morning, her focus shifted entirely to the boy. Something in his gaze felt familiar. She brushed the thought aside, returning to her papers. The prosecutor began their opening statement, but Damian wasn't listening. His gaze remained fixed on Caroline, his hands gripping the table tighter with each passing second. His heartbeat was loud in his ears, drowning out the droning accusations of the attorney. He didn't care about their version of the story. He didn't care about their opinions. "Defendant," Judge Evans interrupted, her voice sharp. "Is there something you'd like to say?" Damian hesitated, his throat dry. He felt the eyes of everyone in the room boring into him, and yet his focus remained on her. His breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling as the words caught in his throat. His lips trembled. "I know who you are." The statement hung in the air, defying the laws of sound by growing louder with each passing moment. Caroline's pen froze mid-sentence, hovering above the page. The prosecutor faltered, their script thrown off course. A murmur swept through the gallery, a ripple of confusion and curiosity. "Excuse me?" Caroline's voice was colder now, her eyes narrowing as she studied the boy before her. She saw more than she wanted to. The line of his jaw, the shape of his nose. It tugged at something buried deep within her. "You're my mother." Damian's voice cracked, but his words were clear, resolute. He wasn't asking. He was declaring. Gasps erupted from the audience, a chain reaction of shock and disbelief. Someone whispered, "Did he just say?" Caroline's face remained frozen, her professional mask unbroken, yet her hand trembled ever so slightly as she set her pen down. The silence in the room was deafening, but inside her mind, chaos reigned. Memories she had spent decades suppressing began to claw their way to the surface. A young woman, barely more than a child, standing on a hospital floor with tears streaming down her face. A baby swaddled in a pale yellow blanket, his cries piercing her heart. "I don't know what you're talking about," Caroline said finally, her voice low but unsteady. She felt exposed in a way she never had before, every wall she had built around her life cracking under the weight of those 4 words. "You're my mother." "You gave me away," Damian continued, tears streaming down his face now, his voice raw. "My foster mom told me everything." Caroline's composure faltered. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, she felt as though the room was shrinking around her. She couldn't breathe. "I need a recess," she said abruptly, her voice barely above a whisper. She rose to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she turned and fled to her chambers. Behind her, the courtroom erupted into chaos. Murmurs, questions, frantic notes from reporters scribbled on yellow legal pads. But none of that mattered to Damien. He slumped back into his chair, his tears blurring the polished wood of the table in front of him. The words he had been holding on to for years had finally escaped, but they left behind a hollow ache. And Caroline? She locked the door to her chambers, pressing her back against the cold wood as her breath came in shallow gasps. The echo of Damien's voice reverberated in her mind. "You're my mother." For the first time in her life, Judge Caroline Evans had no idea what to do. The chambers were suffocatingly quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Caroline Evans leaned against the heavy oak door, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. She had faced hardened criminals, relentless attorneys, and emotionally charged cases, but nothing had prepared her for this. For him, for Damien. The boy's words replayed in her mind, an unrelenting echo. "You're my mother." She squeezed her eyes shut, as if darkness could somehow shield her from the memories clawing their way to the surface. It was the winter of her 18th year when she had last seen him. Snow had blanketed the streets, muffling the world outside as she sat in a sterile adoption agency office. Her parents flanked her, their expressions cold and determined. "You're doing the right thing," her mother had said, her voice as sharp as the chill in the air. But Caroline hadn't felt right. She had felt hollow, as though a part of her had been carved out and left behind. She remembered holding him for the last time, a tiny bundle of warmth wrapped in a yellow blanket. His cries had been soft but insistent, as if begging her not to let go. A knock on the chamber door yanked her back to the present. Caroline straightened, adjusting her judicial robe as though it could shield her from the storm brewing outside. "Yes," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. The door opened cautiously, and her clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stepped in. "Judge Evans," he began, hesitating. "The courtroom is waiting. Do you need more time?" "More time? If only." "No," she said firmly, her voice sharpening into the tone of authority she had perfected over the years. "I'll return shortly." "Thank you." He nodded, retreating silently. The door clicked shut, and Caroline exhaled, her breath trembling as it left her. She moved to her desk, her gaze falling on a framed photograph of her daughter, Emma, now in her early 20s. Emma, the golden child with a bright future and a life unmarred by secrets. Until now. Caroline ran her fingers over the edge of the photo frame, her mind racing. What would Emma think if she found out about Damien? About the life Caroline had buried so deep that not even her closest friends knew? She forced herself to focus. This was a courtroom matter, she told herself, not a personal crisis. The boy's claim was audacious, but unsubstantiated. And yet, the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the sharp line of his jaw, there were pieces of herself in him that she couldn't deny. Back in the courtroom, Damien sat at the defendant's table, his hands balled into fists on his lap. His public defender, Mr. Tate, leaned over to whisper something, but Damien wasn't listening. His focus was on the door to the judge's chambers, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped bird. He had spent years imagining this moment, fantasizing about what he would say if he ever found her. He thought it would bring him relief, maybe even closure. Instead, he felt raw, exposed, as if he had laid his soul bare only to be met with silence. "I told you this was risky," Mr. Tate muttered, his voice barely audible. "You should have let me handle it." Damien turned to him, his voice sharp. "She's not just a judge. She's my mom." Tate sighed, his face lined with exhaustion. "You don't know that for sure." "Yes, I do," Damien insisted, his voice rising slightly. Heads in the gallery turned, their whispers like static in the air. The courtroom doors opened, and Caroline strode in, her steps measured, her face a mask of composure. But Damien noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she picked up the gavel. "This court is back in session," she announced, her tone crisp. Her eyes swept the room, landing on Damien for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. The prosecutor stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, given the defendant's claims, I believe it would be prudent to address the validity of his statement." "That's enough," Caroline cut in, her voice firm. "This courtroom is not a venue for baseless accusations. Damien shot to his feet. "It's not baseless," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You know it's true. You can feel it, can't you?" "Sit down," Caroline commanded, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "No!" Damien's fists clenched at his sides. "You don't get to ignore me. You don't get to pretend I don't exist." The room fell into a stunned silence. Caroline's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of her bench. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with unspoken tension. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is not the time or place for this discussion." Damien stared at her, his chest rising and falling as he fought to steady his breathing. "When then?" he asked, his voice heavy with despair. "When is the right time for you to admit the truth?" Caroline opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she reached for her gavel, her hand trembling as she struck it against the wood. "This court is in recess," she said, rising abruptly and disappearing once more into her chambers. As the courtroom erupted into murmurs and speculation, Damien sank back into his chair, his heart heavy. For him, this wasn't about the case anymore. It was about her, about the truth she seemed so desperate to deny. And for Caroline, the truth was a storm she could no longer outrun. The courtroom buzzed like a hive of restless bees, whispers ricocheting off the walls. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, eyes darting between the empty judge's bench and Damien. To them, this was a spectacle, a drama that would dominate headlines. But to Damien, this was his life. He sat slumped in his chair, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the worn wood of the defendant's table. His mind churned, replaying the moment Caroline's voice had faltered, the crack in her composure. That fleeting hesitation was enough to fuel his resolve. "She knows I'm right," he thought. "She just doesn't want to admit it." At the back of the courtroom, Grace Hall stood watching, her presence unassuming but deliberate. The social worker had seen too many cases like Damien's. Children shuffled through a system that was more interested in order than care. But this case was different. She had known Damien since he was a quiet 8-year-old with questions too big for his small shoulders to bear. She had seen his anger grow alongside his hope, and now both emotions were on full display. Taking a deep breath, Grace approached the defendant's table. She crouched beside Damien, her voice low and steady. "You did what you needed to do, Damien, but now you need to let her process it." Damien turned to her, his eyes blazing. "Process it?" She walked away. Again, just like before, Grace's face softened, her expression tinged with empathy. "You dropped a bombshell, kid. It's going to take her time to pick up the pieces. But I promise you, she heard you." Damien's jaw tightened, his gaze drifting to the empty bench. "She shouldn't need time. She should have been ready for this the second she saw me." Grace straightened, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes people don't know how to face what they've buried. That doesn't mean they don't care." Inside her chambers, Caroline paced back and forth, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She felt caged, like a bird in a gilded prison of her own making. The walls seemed to close in, heavy with the weight of secrets long buried. Her chest tightened as she glanced at the photograph of her daughter on her desk. Emma's bright smile stared back at her, oblivious to the storm brewing in her mother's life. Her thoughts churned relentlessly. She had spent years building a life of structure and control, burying the chaos of her past beneath the veneer of success. But now that past had walked into her courtroom and looked her in the eye. A knock at the door snapped her back to the present. "Judge Evans." It was Grace's voice, calm but firm. Caroline hesitated, her hand hovering over the desk. Finally, she squared her shoulders and opened the door. Grace stepped in, her expression unreadable. "I hope I'm not intruding," Grace began, her tone measured. "But I think you and I need to talk." Caroline gestured to a chair, her movements stiff. "Go ahead." Grace sat, folding her hands neatly in her lap. "Damien is a good kid. A little stubborn, sure, but he's been through more than most people could imagine." Caroline crossed her arms, leaning against the edge of her desk. "This isn't about him being a good kid. It's about facts. And the fact is, he's accusing me of something I have no proof of, Grace tilted her head, her gaze steady. Do you really not see it? The way he looks at you, the way you looked at him? There's more than proof in this. Caroline's jaw tightened. You don't understand? I understand more than you think. Grace interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. I was there when he was placed in foster care. I've seen his file. I've seen the gaps, the unanswered questions. And now I'm standing in front of one of those answers. Caroline's composure wavered, her eyes darting to the side. You think I don't feel it? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. You think I don't see the resemblance? But I can't. Can't what? Grace pressed. Acknowledge him? Admit that he's been looking for you his whole life? You don't have to have all the answers, Judge Evans. But you owe him honesty. Caroline's breath hitched. Honesty. It sounded so simple, yet it was the one thing she had avoided for so long. Back in the courtroom, Damien sat alone, his public defender absent, likely overwhelmed by the unfolding drama. The murmur of voices around him felt distant, like static on a broken radio. He stared at the judge's chamber's door, willing it to open. And then it did. Caroline stepped out, her expression carefully composed but her movements deliberate. She returned to the bench, her gaze meeting Damien's for a brief, charged moment. This court is back in session, she announced, her voice steady but quieter than before. The prosecutor opened his mouth to speak, but Caroline raised a hand, silencing him. Before we proceed, I need to address the defendant directly. A collective hush fell over the room. All eyes turned to Caroline as she leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly on the bench. Damien, she began, her voice trembling just enough for him to notice. This isn't the place for personal matters. But I want you to know. She paused, the weight of her words crushing her chest. Damien leaned forward slightly, his eyes wide, desperate. I want you to know that I hear you, she finished, her voice soft but resolute. And we will talk. The room buzzed with renewed whispers, but Damien didn't care. For the first time, he felt something crack open in the wall she had built between them. It wasn't enough, not yet. But it was a start. The courtroom emptied slowly, the buzz of conversation lingering like the scent of rain on asphalt. Reporters shuffled out, their notebooks filled with enough drama to fuel a week of headlines. Damien, however, remained seated. His legs felt like lead, his body unwilling to move. He stared at the polished wood of the defendant's table, replaying her words. I hear you. And we will talk. They were small words, almost insignificant, but to him, they were everything. Grace approached him quietly, her shoes barely making a sound on the tiled floor. She crouched beside him again, her hand resting lightly on his arm. You got through to her, she said, her voice soft. That's more than most people would have managed. Damien didn't look at her. It's not enough, he muttered. She just said it to calm everyone down. Grace shook her head. No, Damien. I saw her face. She's shaken. And that's not a bad thing. Damien finally turned to her, his eyes rimmed with frustration and hope that he was too afraid to feel. What if she just keeps avoiding it? What if I never get the truth? Grace's hand squeezed his arm gently. You have to be patient. I know that's the last thing you want to hear, but this is bigger than just you. It's her entire world. People don't dismantle walls they've spent decades building in one day. Damien sighed, slumping further into his chair. I've waited my whole life. How much longer am I supposed to wait? Grace straightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. Sometimes the hardest part isn't waiting, Damien. It's deciding what you'll do when the answers come. In her chambers, Caroline sat at her desk, staring at the drawer where an old photograph lay buried. Her hands hovered over it, trembling slightly, before she finally pulled it open. The picture was faded, the edges worn. It showed a newborn baby wrapped in a pale yellow blanket, his face scrunched up in sleep. She ran her fingers along the frayed edges, her chest tightening as memories she had tried to suppress rose like ghosts. She could still feel the weight of him in her arms, the warmth of his tiny body. She could still hear her mother's stern voice echoing in her ears. You'll ruin your future if you keep him. You're just a child yourself. Her fingers curled around the photo as tears stung her eyes. She had told herself that giving him up was the only way, that he would have a better life. But had he? The haunted look in Damien's eyes told her otherwise. A sharp knock broke the silence. Caroline quickly slipped the photo back into the drawer and straightened her posture. "Come in," she called, her voice steady. The door opened to reveal Grace, her expression calm but resolute. She stepped inside and closed the door softly behind her. "You've already made up your mind, haven't you?" Grace asked, cutting straight to the point. Caroline raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. "And what decision would that be?" "To keep pushing him away," Grace replied, folding her arms. "To protect your reputation, your career, your life." "But at what cost, Judge Evans?" Caroline's jaw tightened. "This isn't about my career. It's about what's appropriate. That boy is your son," Grace interrupted, her voice firm but not unkind. "And he's been searching for you his whole life." Caroline looked away, her eyes fixed on the corner of her desk. "I don't know what he wants from me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "What could I possibly say to him that would make up for everything he's been through?" Grace stepped closer, her tone softening. "He doesn't want you to fix everything. He just wants to know why. Why you gave him away. Why you didn't come back for him. Why you had to go through all of it alone." Caroline swallowed hard, her throat tight. "And if I tell him, then what? What if it just makes everything worse?" Grace's gaze softened. "You don't get to decide how he feels about the truth. You just have to give it to him. It's the only way either of you can move forward." For a long moment, Caroline said nothing. The weight of Grace's words settled heavily on her shoulders, pressing against the fragile composure she had worked so hard to maintain. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely audible. "I'll talk to him." The conference room was small and sterile, its stark white walls offering no comfort. Damien sat at the table, his hands clasped tightly together. His heart pounded in his chest as the door opened, and Caroline stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Caroline hesitated, her fingers tightening around the back of the chair before she finally sat down across from him. Her eyes searched his face, finding pieces of herself in the curve of his jaw, the shape of his nose. Damien broke the silence, his voice low and trembling. "Why did you give me away?" Caroline's breath hitched, her composure faltering. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just the boy he was but the life he had lived without her. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the table. "I was young," she began, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I was 18, scared, and my parents convinced me it was the only way. They told me you'd have a better life without me." Damien's jaw tightened, his voice filled with quiet anger. "Better? You think bouncing from one foster home to another was better?" Caroline's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know. I thought someone would adopt you, that you'd have a family. But you didn't check," Damien said, his voice breaking. "You didn't even try to find me." Caroline's tears spilled over, her voice choked with regret. "You're right. I didn't. I was a coward. And I'm so sorry." The room fell silent, the weight of her confession settling between them. For Damien, it wasn't enough to erase the years of pain, but it was a start. And for Caroline, it was the first step toward mending what had been broken. The conference room felt smaller now, as if the weight of their shared past had pressed the walls closer together. Damien sat rigid, his fists clenched on the table, as Caroline's confession hung in the air like an unfinished symphony. Her words had cracked open the foundation of his anger, but the rubble still lay scattered between them. Caroline's hands trembled as they rested on the table, her eyes fixed on Damien's face. She had spent decades building walls to protect herself from this moment, but now that they were gone, she felt exposed, vulnerable. "I know I can't undo what I've done," she said softly, "and I don't expect you to forgive me." Damien's eyes snapped up to meet hers, his voice sharp and laced with pain. "Then why are you even here? If you're just going to tell me how sorry you are and walk away again, what's the point?" Her breath caught, his words slicing through her defenses like a blade. "Because you deserve the truth," she said, her voice trembling. "And because I want to try. I want to be here now, Damien, if you'll let me." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. His expression was a mixture of defiance and disbelief. "Now? After all this time? What do you think that's going to fix?" Caroline looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together as though searching for an anchor. Nothing, she admitted. It won't fix anything. But maybe it could be a start. Damien's chest heaved as he struggled to contain the whirlwind of emotions inside him. Anger, sadness, hope. You don't get to just show up and expect me to believe you care, he said, his voice cracking. I've spent my whole life wondering why I wasn't good enough. Why you didn't want me? Caroline's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. Damien, no, she said, her voice thick with emotion. It was never about you not being good enough. It was about me. I was scared. I didn't think I could give you the life you deserved. But you didn't even try, he shouted, the words bursting out of him like a dam breaking. You didn't fight for me. You just left me. Tears streamed down her face now, her carefully composed facade crumbling under the weight of his pain. You're right, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I failed you. I failed in every way that matters. And I've hated myself for it every single day. The room fell into a heavy silence, the only sound the muffled hum of the courthouse outside. Damien stared at her, his breathing uneven as he tried to process her words. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but it had never felt like this. He had expected to feel victorious, vindicated. Instead, he felt raw, exposed, as if the anger he had carried for so long had left him hollow. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter now. Do you even care about me? Or are you just trying to ease your guilt? Caroline reached across the table, her hand trembling as she rested it inches from his. I care, Damien, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. I've cared since the day you were born. I just didn't know how to face it. He stared at her hand for a long moment, his own fingers twitching as if torn between reaching out and pulling away. I don't know if I can believe you, he said finally. Caroline nodded, her throat tight. I understand. But if you'll let me, I want to prove it to you. I want to try to be the mother you deserved, even if it's years too late. The conversation ended not with a resolution, but with a fragile understanding. As they left the conference room, Damien walked ahead, his steps heavy with unresolved emotions. Caroline followed at a distance, her mind racing with thoughts of what came next. In the hallway, Grace was waiting. Her gaze shifted between the two of them, her expression unreadable. How did it go? She asked, her voice calm but curious. Damien didn't answer. Instead, he walked past her, his shoulders tense as he disappeared down the corridor. Caroline stopped in front of Grace, her face pale and drawn. He hates me, she said, her voice barely audible. Grace studied her for a moment before shaking her head. No, he doesn't. He's hurt. There's a difference. Caroline's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. What if I can't fix this? What if I've already lost him? Grace's expression softened. You haven't lost him, she said gently. But you need to stop thinking about fixing things. It's not about erasing the past. It's about building something new. Caroline nodded slowly, her gaze drifting down the hallway where Damien had disappeared. I just don't know where to start, she admitted. Grace placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Start by showing up, she said. The rest will follow. Caroline took a deep breath, her mind brimming with doubt, but also a flicker of determination. She wasn't sure if Damien would ever forgive her, but for the first time, she was willing to try. The day after the confrontation in the conference room, Damien sat on the edge of his bed in the cramped apartment he shared with two other foster kids. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting stripes across the worn carpet. His thoughts were a chaotic mix of anger, confusion, and something he couldn't quite name, a tiny flicker of hope. He hated himself for feeling it, but it was there, undeniable. Her words lingered in his mind. I want to try. He scoffed aloud, shaking his head. Try what? He muttered. For years, the idea of his mother had been a shadowy figure, an absence he filled with stories of his own making. But now, she had a face, a voice, a reality, and he didn't know what to do with it. Across town, Caroline sat in her office, staring at a blank notepad. Her gavel rested on the desk beside it, a reminder of the authority she wielded every day in the courtroom. But today, that authority felt hollow. No ruling, no verdict could guide her through what she faced now. A knock on the door startled her. She straightened, smoothing her hair as Grace stepped in, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a small folder in the other. "Thought you could use this," Grace said, setting the cup on the desk. She hesitated before placing the folder beside it. "And this?" "It's Damien's case file. I thought it might help you understand." Caroline hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of the folder. She had spent her entire career teaching herself not to get emotionally involved, to keep her professional life separate from her personal one. But Damien had obliterated that line the moment he walked into her courtroom. She opened the folder slowly, her eyes scanning the pages. It was all there. The list of foster homes he'd lived in, the complaints he'd filed, the notes from social workers who had written him off as difficult. Her stomach twisted with every word. The guilt she had carried for years began to swell, threatening to drown her. "I didn't know it was this bad," she murmured, her voice breaking. Grace sat across from her, her tone calm but firm. "You couldn't have known. But now you do. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Caroline looked up, her eyes meeting Grace's. For the first time, she saw not just a social worker, but someone who had been there for Damien when she wasn't. "I don't even know where to begin," she admitted. Grace leaned back in her chair, her expression softening. "You begin by showing up. Damien doesn't need grand gestures or promises you can't keep. He just needs to see that you're willing to be there." Caroline nodded slowly, the words settling in her mind like seeds waiting to take root. "I'll figure it out," she said, more to herself than to Grace. Later that afternoon, Damien was sitting on the cracked bench at his neighborhood basketball court, a ball resting on his knees. He came here when he needed to think, the rhythm of the game soothing in its simplicity. But today, the court was empty, and the silence only amplified his inner turmoil. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. He looked up to see Caroline standing at the edge of the court, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She was out of place here, her tailored jacket and polished shoes a stark contrast to the chipped paint and broken hoops. "Hey," she said softly, her voice hesitant. Damien narrowed his eyes. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you," she said, stepping closer. "To talk. If you'll let me," he sighed, leaning back against the bench. "What could you possibly say that I haven't already heard?" Caroline took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she shoved them into her pockets. "Probably nothing, but I thought I'd try anyway." Damien gestured to the empty bench beside him. "Fine, talk." She sat down, the silence between them heavy and awkward. "I read your file," she said finally, her voice quiet. "I saw what you went through, and I want you to know. I'm sorry. For all of it. For not being there when you needed me." Damien's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I can't change what happened," she continued. "But I want to try to be there for you now. However you'll let me. No pressure, no expectations. Just one step at a time." Damien studied her face, searching for cracks in her sincerity. But all he saw was a woman who looked as lost and broken as he felt. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can trust you," he admitted. "Not yet." Caroline nodded, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I understand, and I don't expect you to. But I'm not going anywhere this time, Damien. That's a promise." The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't as suffocating as before. For the first time, it felt like the beginning of something. Not a resolution, but a fragile bridge between two people who had spent years lost in their own pain. In the days that followed, Caroline began taking small steps to rebuild their connection. She showed up at the youth center where Damien played basketball, watching quietly from the sidelines. She attended his tutoring sessions, meeting his mentors and learning about the world he had built for himself. And though Damien remained guarded, she noticed the subtle changes in him, the way his posture softened, the way he stopped flinching every time she spoke. Each moment was a small victory, a reminder that healing wasn't about erasing the past, but about choosing to move forward. And for the first time in years, Caroline and Damien both began to hope. The courtroom was quiet again, but this time it wasn't filled with the weight of accusation or confrontation. Instead, there was a quiet sense of anticipation, like the stillness before the first note of a symphony. Damien stood beside Caroline, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His nerves felt like a live wire under his skin, but he forced himself to stay calm. Today wasn't about the past. It was about moving forward. Across the room, Grace sat in the gallery, a small smile on her face as she watched the two of them. She had seen countless stories like this, but few had ever ended with this kind of hope. Beside her sat a few of Damien's mentors and friends from the youth center, their presence a silent show of support. The judge presiding over the proceedings, a kind-faced man in his 60s, glanced at the papers before him. His tone was warm as he spoke. "We're here today to formalize the legal guardianship of Damien Brooks by Judge Caroline Evans. Both parties have expressed a willingness to move forward with this arrangement, and all requirements have been met." Caroline glanced down at Damien, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and nervousness. She had fought for this moment, not in the courtroom, but within herself. She had wrestled with her guilt, her fear, and her doubts, and now she stood here, ready to take on a responsibility she had once run from. "Damien," the judge continued, his gaze settling on the young man, "this is an important decision for both of you. Do you agree to this arrangement?" Damien hesitated, his eyes darting to Caroline's face. He saw the same nervousness in her eyes that he felt in his chest. But there was something else there too, something steady and real. He nodded. "Yeah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I do." The judge turned to Caroline. "And Judge Evans, do you accept guardianship of Damien Brooks, with all the responsibilities that come with it?" Caroline straightened her back, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Yes, I do." A small round of applause broke out in the gallery, and the judge smiled. "Then it's official. I wish you both the best as you begin this new chapter." After the ceremony, the group gathered outside the courthouse. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the steps, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Damien felt a sense of lightness. It wasn't joy exactly. He wasn't there yet, but it was something close to it. Grace approached them, her smile wide and genuine. "Congratulations," she said, her voice full of warmth. "You've both come a long way." Caroline nodded, her gaze drifting to Damien. "We still have a long way to go," she admitted. "But we'll get there." Damien shifted awkwardly, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't used to this attention, this feeling of being cared for. "Thanks, Grace," he mumbled, his voice softer than usual. Grace gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're a good kid, Damien. Don't ever forget that." As Grace stepped away, Caroline turned to Damien. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I was thinking we could grab dinner. Just the two of us. If you want." Damien raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me?" Caroline smiled faintly. "I figured I should, considering I missed out on about 17 years of dinners." He chuckled despite himself. "All right, but no fancy places. I'm not dressing up." "Deal," she said, relief flooding her voice. That evening, they found themselves at a small diner on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a handful of tables and a menu laminated to the point of being indestructible, but it felt right. Comfortable. Caroline sipped her coffee as she watched Damien pick at his burger. The silence between them wasn't awkward this time. It was peaceful, filled with the quiet understanding that they didn't have to figure everything out all at once. "Can I ask you something?" Damien said suddenly, his eyes meeting hers. "Of course," Caroline replied, setting down her cup. "Do you think it would have been different?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "If you had kept me?" Caroline's breath hitched, and she took a moment to gather her thoughts. "I've thought about that question every day," she admitted. "And I honestly don't know. Maybe it would have been better. Or maybe I wouldn't have been ready, and we both would have suffered. But the truth is, I'll never know. All I can do now is try to make up for the time we lost." Damien nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table. "I guess that's fair." "It's not fair," Caroline said softly. "None of this is. But we have now, and that's what matters." He looked up at her, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I guess it is." As they left the diner, the sky was streaked with orange and pink, the kind of sunset that made the world feel just a little more hopeful. Caroline walked beside Damien, her steps falling in rhythm with his. For the first time, she felt like she was where she was meant to be. Damien glanced at her, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. So, what now? Caroline smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. Now we figure it out. Together. For the first time in a long time, Damien let himself smile back. All right. Together. As they walked into the fading light, the weight of the past didn't disappear, but it felt lighter. They weren't perfect, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But they had something they hadn't before, a chance. And for both of them, that was enough.